Since we're here in a festival that celebrates books like yours, there's also, as you mentioned in the beginning, this is the 105th anniversary of Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species. It was a revolutionary work. But very often revolutionary works are very difficult for people to understand, not only because it's new, but sometimes even the language is complicated. Karl Marx, Das Kapital, the first volume is almost unreadable. If you can get through and read second and third, you understand it, but the first one was very complicated. Do you think The Origin of the Species is a complicated book?
No. I think that The Origin of Species is very unusual in a pioneering book. It is very easy to understand. It's written in Victorian English, which is a little bit more long-winded than we're used to today. But the moment you open it, you realize that Darwin was really, really trying to be understood. He wanted to be understood by ordinary people. Not every scholar, unfortunately, has that laudable aim. Darwin thought about his book for a very long time before he wrote it. People often wonder why he waited such a long time after he first wrote down his theory in a reasonably full form in 1844. He then waited until 1859 before he actually published the book. And even then, he was pushed into it by the fact that Wallace, another English naturalist who traveled in South America as Darwin did, independently thought of the idea. Why did Darwin wait so long? One idea is that he wanted to wait so long because he really was trying to gather together all the evidence to make it totally convincing and write it down in a totally understandable way. He was planning to write a much bigger book, and it was The Origin of Species was actually what he called the abstract of his much bigger book. And he wrote it in 1859 because in 1858 Wallace sent him a letter which was identical to his own theory. And as you may know, there was a very gentlemanly solution to the possible priority dispute. Papers by Darwin and Wallace were read out on the same day at the Linnean Society in London. However, on that occasion, in 1858, nobody took any notice. It had to wait for the book, The Origin of Species, which was published the following year in 1859. Then everybody sat up and took notice.
As you mentioned, Darwin was a Victorian, a product of his time. And in part of his writings, he implies a superiority of man in relation to women. Pretty much a bit like Freud did, also a Victorian. So you think they were both, or at least Darwin, kind of products of their times, and their science suffered.
Yes, Darwin was a Victorian, and like all Victorians, he showed traces of what we would today recognize as sexism and racism. This was absolutely normal at the time. And of course, any historian worth her or his salt would learn to read without being offended by that. Darwin and Wallace were actually much less racist than many of their contemporaries. Darwin fought against slavery very vigorously, for example. But as for the sexism, as for the regarding of women as inferior, I find it an astonishing fact that in most countries of the world, women didn't get the vote until well into the 20th century. I don't know when they got the vote in Brazil. In Britain, I think it wasn't until the 1920s. The United States, it wasn't until the 1920s. I think of major Western countries, only New Zealand and some states of Australia had women voting towards the end of the 19th century. So it was standard to be sexist and racist. Even Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, who was right in the vanguard of liberal, radical, progressive opinion in his time, reads today like the most terrible racist that you could imagine. No, not the most terrible you could imagine. He was only moderately, but he would say things like, of course, nobody would seriously maintain that our dusky cousins could possibly match us for intellectual ability, that kind of thing. Now, that was progressive opinion, liberal opinion for its time. You can imagine what the less progressive opinion was like. To me, this is a very encouraging indicator of how the zeitgeist moves really quite rapidly, even going back to, well, within my lifetime and before. If you read fiction, detective fiction of the 1920s, Agatha Christie, Bulldog Drummond, you find what sounds the most atrocious racism in these books, just absolutely normal and accepted in the 1920s. How things change, how rapidly things change. In The God Delusion, I make this the basis for an argument against the suggestion which you raised earlier, that you need religion in order to be moral. The fact that the moral zeitgeist moves so rapidly from decade to decade, and we all move together, whether we're religious or not. In the 1920s, a lot of people would have been racist and sexist, whether they were religious or not. Today, most educated people are at least much less so, whether they're religious or not. We move on with great rapidity, with dramatic rapidity, and religion doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. I think it's a fairly telling piece of evidence.